don't think they'll have any regrets. And I just want to kind of bring back to something that Jenny just said. Ultimately, I think, again, attributing words to Prince William and then acting though as these are words of authority, in the sense that Meghan should have to put up or didn't have the gravitas in order to deal with the abuse that she was facing. I think this gaslighting of women are the whole point of the fact that, well, this is just the way that the media works, and you have to deal with it. It's completely unacceptable. And also, there was no need for Jenny to kind of tell her about her mature age. I think ultimately the reality is that Harry is right about the media, and the media is sexist and racist, and we have to look at ourselves. I don't really care how much research you do as a royal correspondent; it still doesn't absorb you from the realities of the things that you write. And I think ultimately, to your question, Ben, I don't think they're going to have any regrets in 10 years' time. But I ultimately do hope that the two brothers do come together, because, like you said, this new generation of royals really care about things that are not just happening in this country, but that are happening globally. Like, for example, we could be talking about the women in Iran, the things that happen in Afghanistan. And I know those are things that Meghan and Kate both care about. So let's really give these women the opportunities to talk about the things that they care about, rather than creating this kind of hoo-ha around the fallout of the brothers, essentially.
Hello, family, and welcome back. And there it is. Calm, clear, no theatrics. Just straight truth dropped into a conversation that usually bends itself into knots, trying not to say it. Because what Nimco Ollie just did was remove the usual safety net. No vague language, no polite cushioning. She said it plainly. The media is sexist, it is racist, and it needs to look at itself. And suddenly, you can almost hear the discomfort through the screen. Now watch how this always plays out. The second someone says something that direct, the response isn't, let's examine that. No, it's deflection, denial, and a sudden obsession with tone. Not the substance, the tone. Because if you can make the delivery the problem, you never have to deal with the message. It's the oldest trick in the book, and somehow it still gets treated like a fresh idea every single time. But here's the thing. This conversation didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't just appear because people felt like being dramatic one afternoon. It exists because of what we've all watched happen repeatedly to Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. And no, not in that vague, everyone gets criticized way people love to hide behind. We're talking about a very specific pattern, a pattern where the same actions are framed completely differently depending on who is doing them. Where the tone shifts, the language sharpens, the scrutiny intensifies, and somehow we're still expected to believe that's random. It's not random. It's consistent, and consistency like that doesn't happen by accident. Let's go back for a second. Remember how quickly the narrative around Meghan was established? Not built slowly over time based on nuanced observation. No, it was immediate. Aggressive, defined early and then reinforced over and over again until it started to feel like fact instead of framing. That's how powerful media narratives are. Say something enough times, in enough slightly different ways, and eventually people stop questioning it. It becomes background noise, accepted, normalized, and the person at the center of it all? They stop being a full human being and start being treated like a character in a storyline everyone else is writing. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this is exactly what Prince Harry has been talking about for years. Not in vague terms, not in coded language, directly, repeatedly. And every time the response has been to either dismiss it as exaggeration or reframe it as personal grievance. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because pointing out a pattern is not the same thing as complaining. It's identifying something that keeps happening and asking why. But when the system being questioned benefits from not answering that why, suddenly the question itself becomes the issue. Now let's talk about that "you should have been able to handle it" argument, because it keeps showing up like it deserves a seat at the table. Handle what exactly? Being dissected for things that, when done by others, were described as charming? Being criticized for behavior that, in a different context, would have been praised? being placed under a microscope so intense that even neutral actions were turned into negative headlines? That's not handling pressure. That's surviving a narrative machine that had already decided what it wanted you to be. And the expectation wasn't just survival, it was silence. That's the part people conveniently ignore. The unspoken rule was take it, don't question it, and definitely don't call it out, because the moment you do, you shift from being the subject of the story to the problem in the story. And that shift, it happened fast. The second Meghan pushed back, the narrative didn't soften, it hardened, because now it wasn't just about controlling the story, it was about controlling the response to the story. And then Harry steps in, and suddenly, everything escalates. Because now it's not just a woman refusing to be quietly defined by external narratives. It's her partner standing beside her and saying, this isn't right, and we're not going to pretend it is. And that is where the system really starts to show its discomfort. Because systems like this don't just rely on participation, they rely on compliance. And when compliance disappears, the reaction is never calm. It's defensive, it's loud, it's relentless. Because if one person successfully challenges the narrative, it raises a dangerous question. What else has been framed this way? That's the part nobody wants to explore too deeply. Now, let's get into what Nimco Ali said about gaslighting, because that word gets thrown around a lot, but here it actually matters. Gaslighting, in this context, isn't just disagreement, it's the repeated dismissal of someone's lived experience by reframing it as misunderstanding, exaggeration, or inability to cope. It's telling someone over and over again that what they are seeing and experiencing isn't real, even when the evidence is sitting right there in front of everyone. And when that happens publicly, at scale, through media narratives, it becomes something bigger than a disagreement. It becomes conditioning. It teaches audiences how to interpret a person before they've even had the chance to form their own opinion. That's not neutral, that's influence. And influence, when left unchecked, becomes power. Which brings us back to the idea that the media needs to look at itself. Not occasionally, not defensively, honestly. Because let's be real, if the roles were reversed, if the patterns we've seen played out differently, would the coverage have been the same? Would the tone have been identical? Would the framing have followed the same trajectory? Deep down, people already know the answer to that. That's why the conversation gets uncomfortable, because admitting that means admitting the system isn't as neutral as it likes to present itself. And neutrality is the brand. Lose that, and suddenly everything has to be reevaluated. Now, here's where the conversation usually tries to escape into safer territory. People start saying, well, what's the solution? Like, acknowledging the problem requires an immediate, perfectly packaged fix. It doesn't. The first step is actually admitting the problem exists without trying to dilute it into something more palatable, without turning it into miscommunication or unfortunate wording or different perspectives. No. Sometimes it's exactly what it looks like. And what it looks like here is a pattern of treatment that aligns far too neatly with broader issues of bias to be dismissed as coincidence. And that's why what Nimco Ali said matters, because she didn't soften it. She didn't wrap it in layers of polite language to make it easier to ignore. She said it directly. And in doing that, she shifted the conversation away from personalities and back onto the system itself, which is exactly where it should have been all along. And then she adds something that honestly might be the most important part. She talks about what we're not focusing on. The actual issues, the global conversations, the things that Meghan cares about, that other women in public life care about, the work, the advocacy, the impact. Because somehow, all of that gets buried under endless cycles of who said what, who feels this way, who is getting along with whom. It's distraction, and not even a subtle one. And the frustrating part is it works. It keeps the conversation exactly where it's easiest to manage, personal, emotional, contained, instead of allowing it to expand into something more meaningful, more challenging, more real. Because once you start focusing on the real issues, the narrative becomes harder to control. It requires nuance, context, depth. And those things don't fit neatly into quick headlines and viral clips. So instead, we get the loop. Drama, reaction, commentary, repeat. And somewhere in that loop, the actual point gets buried again. But not completely, because every now and then someone cuts through it. Not with noise, not with outrage, but with clarity. And clarity, in a space that thrives on confusion and constant motion, is disruptive all on its own. So when people react to this, when they try to downplay it or redirect it or argue around it instead of engaging with it, pay attention to that reaction, because that reaction tells you just as much as the statement itself. It tells you where the discomfort is. And discomfort in conversations like this usually points directly at the truth people are trying not to sit with. So no, this isn't just another media debate that will come and go. It's part of a much bigger conversation about who gets to define narratives, who gets protected by them, and who gets trapped inside them. And right now, for anyone still pretending this is all just random, unconnected, or exaggerated, that illusion is getting harder and harder to maintain. There's also this very deliberate rewriting of history that happens in real time, and it's honestly one of the slickest tricks in the playbook. The same outlets that helped shape the narrative suddenly pivot years later and act like passive observers, like they just stumbled into the story and had nothing to do with how it evolved. No ownership, no reflection, just a quiet little, well, that's how things unfolded. Except things don't just unfold on their own when headlines, language, and framing are being repeated day after day with surgical precision. That's not nature taking its course, that's construction. And pretending otherwise is basically hoping the audience has the memory of a goldfish and the curiosity of a brick. And let's not ignore the way sympathy gets rationed depending on who's being discussed. Because when Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, speaks about her experience, suddenly there's a checklist. Was it the right time, the right tone, the right platform, the right phrasing? Everything gets dissected except the actual content of what she's saying. Meanwhile, others can express far less and receive far more understanding with half the scrutiny. That imbalance doesn't just happen randomly. It reflects who is seen as inherently credible and who has to keep proving their credibility over and over again just to be heard at the same level. And that constant need to prove yourself, that's exhausting by design. And here's the part that really ties it all together. Prince Harry didn't just support Meghan privately and call it bae. He made a very public choice to challenge the machinery behind the narrative, knowing exactly what that would trigger. That's not impulsive, that's intentional. Because once you've seen how the system operates up close, ignoring it becomes its own kind of participation. So when people try to reduce his stance to emotion or rebellion, they're missing the bigger picture entirely. This isn't just about defending a person, it's about confronting a pattern. And patterns don't change because they're politely asked to. They change when someone refuses to keep playing their assigned role in them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.